In the political circles, it's frequently said, you don't want to go back to the reasons. We agree. If we ask questions, we discover we're agreeing for quite different reasons, and we discover that we don't agree if we ask too many questions. In other words, it's by no means obvious to me that when you really know, you may not say, "Oh, now I really know that I don't agree with you." So I see no reason why more deliberation and more common knowledge will necessarily bring more consensus. And it's clear in some sense consensus is what is needed to overcome social choice paradoxes. How you formulate the concept of consensus, maybe like the single-dimensional, the single-peaked preference idea, is a way of saying, well, whatever else we differ on, we agree on what's left and what's right. Using those terms in the political sense, we agree on how to lay them out. So there's a kind of an agreement, even though we may disagree as to which we want. There's a kind of agreement on how to formulate the question. And then, you see, under those conditions, there is a pretty well-defined best answer. But it may be, if you really thought about it, you discover, no, there are really two dimensions. There's, let's say, a foreign policy dimension and a domestic policy dimension. And we've been, by not thinking of them hard enough, we've confused the two. But now that I look at it, they're really two different things. So the situation we have more differences of opinion than we thought we had. So I think deliberative democracy may indeed be a way by which each person has a better judgment, but I see no particular reason why it moves toward consensus or away from consensus. I think cultural diversity, real diversity, there are different kinds of values. Some values just affect your individual behavior. They don't necessarily lead to social problems. In the United States, the idea of wearing a religiously identifiable clothing is not an issue. There's no problem. You wants to come with a head in a chador. Nobody objects. There's from school, and I understand in France that would be considered a major problem. So some of these diversities are taken care of by simply saying they're not. We don't have to agree because they're really matters of individual behavior. But there are very important matters which are matters of social concern, or are taken to be matters of social concern. Marriage laws, for example. Almost every Western country forbids polygamy. Although, in fact, there is polygamy in the United States, and nobody actually prosecutes it unless there are some other circumstances. There are certain groups that practice polygamy actually today, but it's not legal. But there are many. There are some aspects we have to. Now, it happens, my view, and this is an empirical judgment, which we may differ on, that in fact the tendency, in spite of all the problems we're seeing now, the long-run tendencies for homogenization, not for diversity, not for increased diversity. I think people are becoming much more alike than they're becoming this life. You see, if they were completely separate societies, this wouldn't offer any great difficulties. Each society would follow its own ways. The problems only arise when there is contact. But if you have this contact, you're also going to have equalizing effects, I think.
So problems may arise, but it is a matter of time before we find enough focal points, so as to put it.
I think this was what has happened. I may be biased by the United States example, which is full of taking people of all sorts of cultures. They all wind up alike, basically. Of course, I don't mean there's no difference, but the differences become ceremonial, a few quaint festivals or something like that, but nothing basic. Italian Americans and Chinese Americans come from totally different cultures. They behave the same way in business and classroom and politics, You don't see, that's not an issue. In spite of the enormous difference in the origins, there's just no real, it is not, after a while, I don't mean there weren't problems in between. and I think Europe has shown a very remarkable assimilative effect with all the problems. I think you must have to be impressed by the number of people who are not creating problems. And I think it's also true at the international level, just the interactions. So I think this may take time, but I think if you take the Mohammedan world or the Arab world particularly, because it isn't, the problems aren't really so acute in the non-Arab Mohammedan world. They're modernizing at a reasonable rate, and attitudes are going to be evolving along with it. It's if you go back 30 or 40 years ago, the dominant movements there were nationalistic movements, not religious movements. The dominant in the political sphere, I mean, were not nationalistic movements. The rise of a religiously based thing is somehow only fairly recent. I mean, I don't mean the roots aren't very old. They go back centuries to but they were there all the time. But they they moved into the elites and to the governing bodies only in fairly recent time. So my guess is 30 years from now, that will appear as a phase, and but I don't see this as a permanent characteristic at all. So I think in fact, there are many people who think the opposite is the problem. There's too little diversity in the world. Diversity is stimulating, or can be. If it isn't destructive, it's stimulating. People, it's like evolution. The more variable the traits of a species are, the more gain there is, improvement in fitness in a unit of time, because you have more to draw on. You have more variation to draw on. As the let's say imagine a species released into a new environment. They have all sorts of characteristics. Well, there can be some very good ones, some very bad ones. After a while, the bad ones are eliminated. Everybody's good, and after a while, they've perfectly fitted, then there's no more progress. So there are, as I say, there are many people there are a lot of critics who argue that the real problem in the United States, for example, is that we assimilate them too rapidly to get the benefit out of the diversity. Or how, well, for example, I have some fairly strong convictions as to what policy ought to be. I mean, this isn't answering your question. You didn't ask me how to get it. You was asking procedures. For example, I'm rather on the egalitarian side. I see no real problem with pretty high taxes on the rich, and I think that health care should be made universal in the United States. We don't have a universal system now. 15% are uninsured, and many are not very well insured. So these two go together. I'd like to see more or less uniform access. Now going back to that, how would I, apart from advocating, how do I see it should be achieved? Well, I don't think I have any good answer to that question. I mean, openness, obviously, the deliberative thing, the fact that at least these opinions have to be spread is and identified, made available, has to be recognized. I like but there comes a point when it's very hard. All you can do is iterate and hope that you persuade people. That's all I can say. There's nothing, once you grant the basic democratic institutions and the basic idea of liberty of expression. And the liberty of expression means more than just the ability, the literal freedom. You got to have access to public discourse. You got to have some way of making your voices heard. Not merely you're legally entitled to express them, but that they can be heard. And I don't know whether the internet is democratic. I'm not yet. I haven't really adjusted to the internet fully myself. I've yet to see a blog